Watch this video until the end because this story will restore your faith in humanity. Before we begin, please subscribe to Golden Buzzer Stories and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story that touches your heart. Today I am going to tell you about a woman who had absolutely nothing in this world, yet she managed to give everything she had to someone who needed it more than she did. Her name was Margaret, and this is her story. Margaret lived in a small rundown studio apartment on the outskirts of Chicago. The building smelled of old paint and mildew, and the heater made strange noises throughout the cold winter nights. She was 73 years old, a widow who had lost her husband 15 years ago, and a mother who had buried her only son 5 years after that. Her son had died from a rare disease that emptied their savings completely. The medical bills had taken everything. Their house, their car, their retirement funds, everything was gone. All Margaret had left was this tiny apartment with a broken television and a mattress that sagged in the middle. Every morning she would walk to the local food bank to collect whatever they could give her. Some days it was canned beans and stale bread. Other days it was vegetables that were about to go bad. She never complained. She would thank them with a smile that showed her missing tooth and then walk back home slowly because her knees hurt from years of standing on concrete floors working as a cleaner in office buildings. On her way back from the food bank, she always passed by an abandoned church. The church had been closed for years, its windows boarded up and its doors chained shut. But in front of that church, there was a small bench, and on that bench, Margaret noticed something one freezing morning in November. There was a cardboard box, and inside that box, wrapped in an old newspaper, was a baby girl. Margaret stopped walking. She looked around to see if anyone was nearby. The street was empty. The wind was biting cold, and the baby was barely making any sound, which frightened her even more. She put down her bag of groceries and knelt beside the box. The baby was tiny, maybe a few days old, wrapped in a thin newspaper that did nothing to protect her from the cold. Her little face was blue, and she was shivering. Without thinking, Margaret picked her up. She held the baby against her chest, unbuttoned her old coat, and wrapped it around both of them. She forgot about her groceries. She forgot about her aching knees. She walked as fast as she could back to her apartment, praying under her breath that this little soul would survive. When she reached home, she laid the baby on her bed and covered her with every blanket she owned. She boiled water and used a clean cloth to gently warm the baby's skin. For hours she sat there, talking to the baby, singing old songs her mother used to sing to her. She named her Grace, because she believed God had sent this child to give her grace in her final years. Now you might think this is a simple story of a woman finding a baby and taking care of her. But the twist in this story is what Margaret did next, and it will leave you speechless. Margaret knew she could not keep Grace. She was too old, too poor, and too sick herself. She had high blood pressure and diabetes, and she could barely afford her own medication. But she also could not bear to give Grace to an orphanage where she might be lost in the system. So Margaret made a decision. She would give this child everything she had, even if it meant destroying herself in the process. She went to the local church, the one that was still open, and asked to speak to the priest. She told him about Grace and asked for help. The priest contacted social services, and they sent a caseworker to evaluate the situation. The caseworker told Margaret that she could become a foster parent if she could prove she had the means to care for a child. Margaret had no means. Her entire monthly income was $800 from Social Security, and after rent and utilities, she had less than $200 left for food and medicine. But Margaret was determined. She went to every charity organization in the city and told them her story. She applied for every assistance program available. She started babysitting for neighbors, despite her bad knees, just to earn a little extra money. She cut down on her own meals, eating only once a day so she could buy formula and diapers for Grace. Her health started deteriorating. She lost weight, her blood pressure shot up, and she fainted twice in her apartment. But every time she looked at Grace, she smiled and said, "You are worth it." Months passed, and Margaret managed to get approved as a foster parent. She was given a small stipend to care for Grace, but it was barely enough. She continued to sacrifice her own needs for the baby. She wore the same clothes for years. She stopped buying her medication regularly, skipping doses so she could afford shoes for Grace when she started walking. Then came the second twist in this story, one that nobody saw coming. When Grace was 3 years old, a couple showed up at Margaret's door. They were well dressed, driving an expensive car. The woman was crying. The man looked nervous. They introduced themselves as David and Sarah, and they claimed to be Grace's biological parents. Margaret felt her heart stop. She invited them inside, her hands shaking as she made tea. They sat on her old couch, and Sarah began to cry as she told their story. She said they were teenagers when Grace was born. They were scared, homeless, and had no money. They thought leaving Grace at the church would give her a better chance at life because they could not even feed themselves. They had spent the last 3 years trying to get back on their feet, and now David had a good job, they had a home, and they wanted their daughter back. Margaret listened in silence. She looked at Grace, who was playing with a stuffed toy on the floor, laughing and babbling to herself. She had raised this child from a tiny blue baby to a healthy, happy toddler. She had given up everything for her. And now these strangers wanted to take her away. The legal battle that followed was heartbreaking. Margaret could not afford a lawyer, but a local legal aid clinic took her case pro bono. The courts had to decide what was best for Grace. Margaret's age and health were brought up against her. The biological parents had money, stability, and youth on their side. Margaret had only her love and the years of sacrifice she had made. In the end, the court ruled in favor of the biological parents. Margaret was devastated. On the day Grace was taken away, she sat in her empty apartment and cried for hours. She had given everything she had, her health, her money, her years, her love, and now she had nothing again. But this story does not end there. The final twist is what happened 5 years later, and this is where the golden buzzer connection comes in. Margaret continued to live alone in her tiny apartment. Her health grew worse, and she could barely leave her bed. The neighbors checked on her occasionally, bringing food and medicine. One afternoon, there was a knock on her door. When she managed to open it, she found a young girl standing there with a woman. The girl was Grace, now 8 years old, and with her was Sarah, her mother. Sarah was crying. She hugged Margaret and apologized for everything. She explained that they had told Grace about the woman who saved her life, and Grace had begged to meet her. For the next hour, Grace sat with Margaret, holding her hand, telling her about school and her friends. Margaret could barely speak, but her eyes shone with tears of joy. Before they left, Sarah handed Margaret an envelope. Inside was a check for $50,000. Sarah said it was from both of them, David and her, to repay even a fraction of what Margaret had given. They had sold their car to raise this money. Margaret tried to refuse, but Sarah insisted. She said, "You gave us back our daughter. You gave her life when we could not. This is nothing compared to what you gave." But that is not the end of the story. Years passed, and Grace grew up. She never forgot Margaret. She visited her every single year on her birthday. And when Grace turned 18, she made a decision that would change everything. Grace had inherited Margaret's love for music. Margaret used to sing to her when she was a baby, old songs from her own childhood. Grace learned to sing those same songs. She had a voice that could move mountains, a voice that carried the pain and love of the woman who had saved her life. Grace auditioned for Britain's Got Talent. She traveled all the way to London, to the stage where dreams are made. The judges looked at this young American girl with curiosity. She told them she was there to sing for someone special, someone who had given her everything when she had nothing. She began to sing. It was an old song, one that Margaret used to hum when Grace was a baby. The audience fell silent. Tears rolled down cheeks. The judges sat mesmerized. And when she finished, the entire theater erupted in applause. Simon Cowell stood up. He looked at Grace and said, "That was one of the most emotional performances I have ever seen. Who was that person you were singing for?" Grace told them the story of Margaret. She told them about the abandoned church, the cardboard box, the old woman who had nothing but gave everything. She told them about the years of sacrifice, the legal battle, the separation, and the love that never died. By the time she finished, there was not a dry eye in the house. And then it happened. Simon Cowell looked at the other judges. They all nodded. He walked over to the golden buzzer and pressed it. The golden confetti rained down from the ceiling. Grace fell to her knees, crying. The entire theater gave her a standing ovation. She had won the golden buzzer. But she knew, and everyone in that room knew, that this golden buzzer belonged to Margaret. A few weeks later, Grace flew back to Chicago. She went straight to Margaret's apartment. Margaret was now 91 years old, frail and weak, barely able to move. Grace walked in with the golden buzzer trophy in her hands. She placed it on Margaret's lap and said, "This belongs to you. You had nothing, but you gave everything. And because of you, I am here today." Margaret looked at the trophy. She looked at Grace. And with tears streaming down her face, she whispered, "You were worth it. You were always worth it." Margaret passed away peacefully a year later, surrounded by Grace and her family. She left behind no money, no property, no material possessions. But she left behind a legacy of love that would be remembered forever. And somewhere, on a stage in Britain, a golden trophy stands as a reminder that the people who have the least to give are often the ones who give the most. From which part of the country are you watching this video today? Let me know in the comments below. I would love to know where in America my viewers are from. Thank you for watching Golden Buzzer Stories, and remember, sometimes the greatest gifts come from those who have nothing left to give.